Hello, Internet friend. Today on Value Side, I love inflation. So says Donald Trump. Really? I'm David Ravel. His statement was simple, direct, and offensive to nearly every American. When President Donald J. Trump on Wednesday proclaimed that he loved inflation, it was destined to become one of the all-time presidential faux pas. No doubt this one comment will rank up there with Bill Clinton's "it depends on what is," in his defense of the Monica Lewinsky affair, or George H.W. Bush's pledge, "read my lips, no new taxes," just before proposing a substantial tax increase. In Trump, we see a man who holds the nation's economic destiny in his hands, the single leader who must steward our future prosperity. Trump goes on to tell us that as soon as the war with Iran is over, everything will return to normal. Regrettably, nothing could be further from reality, and to proclaim that it will discloses a woeful lack of understanding of how our system operates. Like many people, Trump believes that inflation is due solely to rising prices, a misconception amplified by the way we measure it. In newscasts, government publications, and our day-to-day shopping, we see the price of everyday items rise and naturally assume that those goods and items suddenly cost more. What we miss is that there are two sides to those transactions, and we assume the other side, the side that Donald Trump is ultimately responsible for, is steady and unchanging. Now, the other side of nearly every transaction we perform, with the possible exception of cyber transactions, is the U.S. dollar, our nation's currency. For over 2 centuries, the dollar has been the currency of exchange for the food, shelter, goods, and services that we purchase. If those purchases cost more, then the fault must lie with the other side of the transaction, not with the dollar. This is what Trump asserts when he claims that the Iran war ends, prices will go back to where they were before. Not so fast, Mr. President. What if inflation we're experiencing is also due to the loss of U.S. dollar buying power, not just rising costs? I remember the first time I ran into this seemingly radical concept. It was at a 1970s financial conference. And just like today, runaway inflation was the problem, driven chiefly by the cost, quote unquote, of oil. One of the leading oil company executives was invited to address an audience composed primarily of financial analysts and investment managers. He began his speech by saying that the issue was not rising oil prices. Needless to say, absolutely no one believed him. We all thought that he was trying to dodge responsibility. And like today, everyone in the audience knew that the price of oil was the problem, and if the oil executive lowered his prices, everything would return to normal. He then brought out a couple of charts that absolutely astounded us. The first was a chart of oil priced in gold. The chart was virtually flat, showing that the ounce of gold at the turn of the century purchased 20 barrels of oil, and that this remained the case during the 1970s conference. The next chart he produced was for oil, this time priced in Swiss francs, and again the chart was flat, showing that oil had not moved versus the Swiss francs either. So what really happened? The oil executive asked. The U.S. dollar, priced in oil, gold, or Swiss francs, was declining. The dollar was also declining in price relative to the ordinary goods and services that Americans purchased. It's why the Consumer Price Index, it should more properly be called the U.S. Dollar Purchasing Index, rises. It was also the point that economist Milton Friedman made in his famous comment, quote, "Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomena." Friedman would make this comment over and over again until everyone, especially Washington, began to understand the importance of monetary discipline. Ridding the economy of inflation was difficult and painful, and it lasted throughout the 70s and the early part of the 1980s. There was no magic switch, no turn of the dial that returned the country to positive economic growth. The Federal Reserve used very high interest rates. The nation withdrew from foreign wars, principally Vietnam, and endured a severe recession that significantly lowered demand before inflation finally ended. None of this is news to Donald Trump. Like me, he lived through those very difficult 1970s, and in fact, he endured a couple of bankruptcies back then. So how can anyone, especially the president, say that they, quote, love inflation? It's really inexplicable. Page 2, this week's economy. On Thursday, President Donald Trump announced that a great settlement with Iran was at hand. Both sides in this dispute are working on a memorandum of understanding, he said, to bring the conflict to a peaceful conclusion. Well, you have to give the president credit. It was his first use of a device that businesses often use in negotiations, the MOU. However, by most counts, this was the 38th time that Trump has declared that peace is near. While average Americans are growing weary of these up and down negotiations, Wall Street seems not to tire of Trump's Pollyanna announcements. Markets reacted to the latest peace prospects with a substantial rally on Friday, enough to bring the major averages into the black, with fractional gains in the Dow, S&P, and NASDAQ. But while investors may feel a sense of relief this weekend, costs keep rising. There's a website called IranCostTicker.com with dashes between each, Iran-cost-ticker.com, that keeps a running tally of how much the U.S. taxpayers are doling out. Earlier this month, the cost of the Iran war passed the $100 billion level, and this week it passed $110 billion. A cost, incidentally, which is over and above anything in the federal budget. It's an unplanned expense that will have to be met with a special supplemental appropriation, something that's becoming a normal financial ploy in Washington. Since Donald Trump was sworn in as the nation's 47th president on January 20 of last year, our nation's debt has grown by over $3 trillion. With this kind of government-generated deficit spending, it follows that inflation has nowhere to go but higher. And that's just what we saw this week's most watched measure of inflation, the Consumer Price Index. We also saw it in the Producer Price Index. Consumer prices rose by 4.2% in the last 12 months, the first time in 3 years that retail inflation has been that high. While the producer prices for final demand, that is, at the final buyer level, rose by 6.5%, the largest increase since 2022. In both cases, consumer and producer, the chief driver of these higher costs was energy, chiefly gasoline and diesel, both driven by the Iran conflict and the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. Finally, if we put on our financial cap, we can now see two ways that the Iran conflict is impacting the nation's balance sheet. First, there's the direct cost of fighting the war, a cost, incidentally, that may not yet include the complete accounting of capital assets lost, such as bases, planes, and other equipment. The best current estimate of the cost of the war, as we said, is more than $110 billion. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, is the hike in inflation. It's a difficult to measure, ubiquitous expense borne by everyone, and likely to continue long after any resolution to the war. All we can see now is that inflation is accelerating, and in the past, when inflation marched higher, as it is now, it has proven to be extremely difficult to reverse. So while the conflict with Iran continues, our financial outlook becomes increasingly murky. And that's today's Value Side. For all of our articles and podcasts, visit valueside.com. I'm David Ravel, ValueSide is independently written and researched. The views expressed are strictly my own.